Hi, everyone, and good evening from New York City. My name is Faye Rosenfeld, and I am the Vice President of Public Programs at the New York Public Library. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Live from NYPL with Suzanne Nossel and Akhtar, who will be coming on screen in just a moment to discuss Suzanne's new book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Suzanne is the Chief Executive Officer of PEN America, with whom we are delighted to be co-presenting tonight's event. And she is one of the country's most eloquent voices on matters relating to freedom of expression. Ayad is a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, screenwriter, and novelist who currently serves as a vice president of PEN. We're honored to have them at the library, albeit virtually this evening, to lead us in conversation about issues explored in Suzanne's book, issues that are complex, but so incredibly important for all of us to understand and navigate, particularly during the fractious times we are all living through right now. If you haven't already done so, you can purchase Dare to Speak through the library shop. You can find a link to the shop site in the chat on Zoom or on YouTube. All purchases made at our shop benefit the New York Public Library. Our virtual programs at the library continue next week. On Tuesday, August 11th at 8 p.m., National Book Award winner Edward Ball joins us to discuss his newest book, Life of a Klansman, A Family History of White Supremacy, which he wrote while in residence as a fellow at the library's Cullman for Scholars and Writers, this Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. He will be joined by another former Cullman Fellow and MacArthur Genius Award winner, Saidiya Hartman. The following week, on Tuesday, August 18th, disability activist Alice Wong joins us to discuss her newest book, Disability Visibility, in conversation with fellow activist and comedian Maysoon Zaid. We hope you can join us. Before I invite Suzanne and Ayad on, I need to mention just a few quick housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded. That is to say, you are not being recorded, only the event itself. Second, Suzanne and Ayad will speak for around 45 minutes, and then Suzanne will take questions at the end. You can send questions at any time during the conversation by typing your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can put them in the YouTube chat as well. We'll make sure they get to her, and she'll answer as many as she can. Now, please welcome Ayad Akhtar and Suzanne Nossel.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Ayad.
How are you?
Good to see you.
Are you in New York City?
I am, yeah.
So I'm excited to speak to you today because I get, as a member of the PEN Board of Trustees, I get a chance to spend some time around you and to hear you talk about free speech. It's always invigorating and illuminating, and I think in this time is really, really important. I'm going to sort of start at the beginning with a simple question and just sort of give us the lay of the land. Why did you write this book, and what was the impulse?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'd say the genesis of it really dates back almost 10 years to my work at the Obama State Department. I was involved in US relations at the United Nations and human rights issues. And one of the topics I walked into was this issue of the so-called defamation of religion. And some folks in the audience may remember this. This is in the aftermath of the Danish cartoons controversy, where a Danish newspaper had published a series of cartoons depicting the Muslim prophet Muhammad in kind of outlandish poses, and one was a turban on his head that went into the wick of a bomb. And in the months after the publication of those cartoons, there was sort of an uprising around the world outside of Danish diplomatic installations. There were some riots, people were killed, and it was a very upsetting and tense moment for certain Muslims around the world. And in the wake of that, there's a group of delegations, country delegations at the UN, Islamic majority countries, that came together, and they wanted to do something about religious intolerance toward Muslims. And their idea was a ban on the defamation of religion. So a ban on things like those cartoons, but really broader than that, any kind of insult against religion would have been encompassed in this ban, and they wanted it to be a binding treaty. And they were pushing for this, the UN in Geneva, the UN in New York, and we as the United States, along with the Europeans, the Australians, Canadians, and others, were pushing back mightily because we saw this as a violation of free expression. And so twice a year, we would go to battle, and we would be marshaling our votes and going to embassies around the world, trying to rally people around our cause, and they were doing the same thing. And when I kind of got read into this, I thought, this is the most pointless thing in the world. Like, we're not accomplishing anything to combat religious intolerance, which is actually a goal the US shared. We had an envoy to the Muslim world. We had a different envoy that was focused on Muslim communities in the United States. It was sort of the post 9/11 period still, where there was tension, and the Obama administration was very committed to trying to alleviate that. But here we were sort of doing battle with all these Islamic delegations, and we also weren't advancing the cause of free speech. I think they were becoming more antagonized by it because they saw it as something that they had to fight against. And so we kind of put our heads together and came up with a different approach. And I ended up going to Islamabad and basically saying to the Pakistanis who were in the head of the Islamic conference at the time, what if we got to the same side of the table and worked on a practical agenda to address your concerns about religious intolerance? So we could do things like doubling down on dialogue, on education, on training. We could bring our experts from around the US government and the states who focus on prosecuting hate crimes and addressing Muslim intolerance at the community level, together with their counterparts around the world, and sort of have a whole affirmative agenda to actually get at the underlying issues, but without impinging upon freedom of speech or try to ban any expression. And I won't say it went down right away, but gradually, actually, they did come around. And we ended up with a consensus resolution that was supported by more than 190 countries. Every country in the UN system bought into it. And we actually started a whole series of international meetings to implement it. And they never ran this defamation of religion resolution again. They sort of dropped that. And to me, what that signified was something that's kind of come up in our work at PEN America, sort of in a different guise, which is in the context of being on campus and seeing the ways that the effort to eradicate racism, sexism, anti-LGBT sentiment can kind of cross over into calls to restrict free expression, but that's not fundamentally what it's about. I think if you can get to what it's fundamentally about, and people are convinced that their campuses are becoming more equal and more inclusive, and that free expression doesn't stand in the way of that, you can diffuse some of these clashes and kind of get around to an approach where you're both advancing equality and inclusion and robustly defending free speech. And so that was sort of planted in my head during that work at the State Department, and it's really been underscored by our work at PEN America. And I sort of wanted to put my ideas and observations about doing this work over the years together in a book, and that's sort of what got us this Dare to Speak.
I have one too.
Yeah, they look good together.
Yeah, they do. It's interesting. I don't want to draw us too far afield into a conversation about your work back then doing that work with the Muslim world, but they are competing sacred values, if you will. Like there aren't too many, we don't have too many sacred values left, but free speech may pass, freedom of expression may pass for one of those. And certainly, many Muslims feel that the prophet's reputation or the prophet's image or the prophet's legacy is something that is sacrosanct and can't be spoken against. And the sort of, I do see a mirror in some of what's going on today, as you are outlining, that certain values, certain rights, certain beliefs, that social justice, certain aspects of our society, certain critiques of that, all of those things are actually more important than the ability to speak freely about whatever part of it. And maybe we're leaping ahead a little bit into a conversation that I was expecting to get to a little bit later, but maybe let's just sort of tease it out a little bit. How do you see what's happening right now? And you say, when we get to the root of it, that it's not really about freedom of expression. What do you think the root of it really is? I mean, what's happening right now?
There are a whole series of things happening right now in our country. And I look at it a little bit as sort of a pendulum. And I always, when Trump was elected, one characterization I made was that it was sort of the Thermidorian phase of the demographic revolution, in that the United States was becoming a much more diverse country where, pretty soon we'll have no single predominant ethnic group. And there was a backlash. I think his election reflected in part that backlash. Obama, to me, reflected that drive forward into a much more inclusive country. And it felt great at moments. It felt great on election night in 2008 for a lot of us. And then there was this, really harsh, stinging backlash 8 years later. And now I think what we're seeing with sort of the protests out on the street and this reckoning on anti-racism that's underway is, it's swinging back again. He has, through his own sort of vituperative and hostility and anti-immigrant sentiment and all of that, he has emboldened and strengthened the drive to eradicate bigotry. And he's made people more convinced that we have to double down on this and that we can't tolerate the marginalization of certain populations. I ultimately think, it's a very positive movement, and it's an effort to eradicate this incredibly stubborn legacy of racism and other forms of exclusion that are embedded in our Constitution, and that, I think societally, as a principled matter, we have a commitment to dismantling them, but we've never finished that work, and that work has, perpetually stagnated and been set back. And now there's this, there's a drive to move it forward. So that to me is very powerful. I think in places it does, I sort of imagine it like veering across the double yellow line into something kind of censorious, because there's a feeling that this is so important that if anybody is calling it into question or doubting the tactics or departing from the orthodoxy, that really needs to be put down, because they're a threat to, this imperative mortal struggle that's being waged. And I think, that's where I part ways, because I think the struggle is imperative and mortal, but that silencing those who dispute, disagree, cast doubt is the wrong approach. That ultimately you need to bring around maybe not everybody, but a majority of people, and that's better done through engagement rather than trying to ban or punish speech. And also that, the minute you start down the path of banning and punishing speech, well, who's doing the banning and the punishing? It's the powerful, it's the institutions. It's calling for the university to discipline a professor, or calling for a corporation to get somebody fired, or calling for someone to be banned from a platform. And there may be times where such reprisal is appropriate, but the more you strengthen that power and that authority that those officials have, the greater the risk is that they will use it in self-serving ways. And that to me is why we have the First Amendment, because we worry about that power being vested in the hands of government. So we confine and curtail it because of a fundamental belief that if they have that power, they're likely to misuse it. And I think that's true of other kinds of institutions as well. And so, my caution has been, with this powerful, potent and principled movement that I think on the whole is a very positive thing, that we should be leery of that, propensity to veer into censoriousness. I can understand why it happens, but I don't think it's the right approach.
I want to return to some of these issues, but I want to sort of get back to the book for a second. And, in reading the book, the order of how you kind of approach things is that you start with a analysis, admonition, sort of approach to the conscientiousness of how we should be using language, or how we can approach the use of language with greater consciousness. And you sort of wait until the end of the book to kind of explain why free speech matters. And it's sort of like it's an inversion of what you would normally expect. And I just wonder if you had some thoughts about why you decided to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I thought, someone pointed that out. I mean, I would say I wrote it the way it came to me intuitively, and then someone actually pointed out that sequence and said, I think this chapter on why we protect free speech in the first place should be at the very beginning. But I guess what I concluded is that I really wanted the book to be read by people who are skeptical about free speech, and who've come to, one of the concerns that's arisen in the context of our work at Penn, and particularly our work on college campuses, is that there's sort of a rising generation that is increasingly dubious about free speech. And, it's for a number of reasons. Principally, I'd say that they see free speech and hear free speech invoked predominantly to protect expression that they find nefarious, offensive, victimizing, so hateful speech on campus, or some kind of slur or insult. And when it's pointed out, free speech is mentioned as that which should protect the individual from a comeuppance. And I think when you hear free speech invoked that way time and again, maybe you do get skeptical of whether it really is relevant to you, or is instead a smokescreen to allow for bigotry. And so one of my goals in writing the book was to make an appeal for free speech that could be heard by a rising generation and that would speak to their concerns. And so I did sort of begin with, what I think are the responsibilities of the speaker, and the fact that, even as we enjoy free speech, and this is, it's not a new concept, actually, going back to the Penn Charter from 1948, it talks about the need for voluntary restraint in the exercise of free speech rights. And we've always had that notion. You don't say whatever comes into your head. You wouldn't. There's sort of cartoons about what that would be like if we verbalized everything, and there are good reasons why we don't. And so I felt, beginning with the idea of being conscientious with language and talking about the care that speakers must take, and that the idea that care, that duty of care, escalates when you have a big platform or you're a leader or in charge of an institution. I thought that would be, reflecting that would be one way to try to get this message across, that I'm not just calling open season for hateful speech. And that maybe someone would be inclined to read through to the end of the book and find out why we protect free speech in the first place, if they didn't already know.
I see. So just earlier, right before, you were speaking about institutional abuse of the abuse of power on the part of an institution, sort of castigating or reprimanding somebody for exercising speech that's deemed, whatever, objectionable to whomever. And it seems that there's a movement afoot, or there's a way of thinking or worrying about what's happening afoot, where it's not really institutional power that is creating the censorious effect. I mean, the final effect is always an institution, but a lot of times institutions are reacting because of liability concerns, or corporations are concerned about business. And so it's really it's the disempowered, if you will, who have been empowered by platforms like Twitter and other things, who are expressing objection to speech of that. How could you speak a little bit to that, sort of the nuance of institutional power versus the collective voice?
Sure. I mean, it's complex. You talk about people as the disempowered, and in many respects they may be, but when they all coalesce on Twitter into a throng, their impact can be thunderous and censorious. And we do a lot of work at PEN America on the issue of online harassment, and we see lots of writers and journalists who are, effectively chased off platforms completely because they write about whether it's abortion, or it's a geopolitical issue, or something like police reform, or even now health, contentious issues, and people just come after them. I mean, there's something today about, from a doctor who's arguing that she thinks kids in New York City should go back to school. And the uproar and outrage was so intense that she, sort of had to back off. And so, it may be, and it probably is, that every single person who weighed in on that, singularly was simply expressing their opinion, and they may have been strident in doing so. But the cumulative effect of it can absolutely be this informal, censoriousness that just coalesces. And I've written about that in the book, because I do think the best answer to speech you disagree with, generally speaking, is more speech. But particularly in the internet age, more speech is not a perfect answer, because it can actually be silencing. It can mean whole subjects kind of come off the table, because people know, if they wade into that, on Twitter or on Facebook, the blowback is going to be so intense that they can't tolerate it. And then another piece is sort of the interplay between the mass outrage and the official reprisals. And it may be that we think, it's the institutional leader who's really making the decision about whether to discipline so-and-so. But, what we've seen in a number of instances, and I'd say the Tom Cotton op-ed at the New York Times, or the Woody Allen book at Hachette, which is something that we talked about at Penn quite a bit, is that, particularly when these uprisings are internal and it's a question of employees, the leadership can be very hard pressed to resist that. I think it can feel, almost impossible. And, we want our institutional leaders to be, generally speaking, responsive to their constituents and their staffs, and not to be completely at odds with the mood and the sentiment of whether it's the newsroom or the editorial staff. And so, when that kind of demand is rendered so forcefully, we see a lot of institutional leaders kind of capitulate, even though oftentimes they've sort of said at the beginning they're standing firm, that may not last. And so, one of the things I call for in the book is just trying to a cognizance of the interplay of these different centers of power in the debates. I think, it's great that people have a platform to be able to speak out. In recent debates, we've seen new, previously silenced or marginalized groups being able to weigh in forcefully and exerting more power. And that's a boon for free speech. I think that has to be recognized as well, but it can also have this chilling effect.
Right. So is there such a thing as a right to offend?
There's no right to offend. I mean, but the real question I would say to ask is, who do you want to police the bounds of offense? And that's where, to me, the answer to offense is instilling a conscientiousness so that if you're maybe you're going to offend some of the time, but like at least offend willfully. Don't offend inadvertently. Take the time to be cognizant of who your audience is, of how sensitivities and mores are changing so quickly, in this country and in this accelerated news cycle and with the speed of social media. So there's a lot to be aware of when you speak if you want to avoid inadvertent offense. And I think as a speaker, it sort of behooves you to take that on board. But I would say, while there's no right to offend, we should be leery of affording governments with the power to police offense, and not just governments. I would put institutions and corporations, under that heading as well. Because I'll give one small example. A Penn member, Walter Mosley, who's in a writer's room for a television show in Los Angeles, and he, he's obviously a Black American writer of, great acclaim. And in a discussion in that writer's room, he used the N-word and he spoke it out loud. And he then, hours later, was very surprised to get a phone call from the Human Resources Department at the studio saying that was out of line. And, he had violated the mores of that writer's room and people were offended. And he wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times talking about it, sort of saying, I am the N-word in the news, in the writer's room. And he was really affronted by the idea, that this purported offense was being policed by somebody else. And so, I think it's just a powerful illustration of the risks of affording authorities with the jurisdiction and the discretion to police offense, because the bounds of offense can be very subjective.
But presumably that dust up actually came from a complaint in the writer's room of somebody who was offended by his use of the word.
I think that's right.
Right. So it isn't, again, it goes back to that question of where that line is drawn. And it's interesting that we started with this conversation about sort of the prophet, because I'm very familiar throughout my childhood with that issue. And, have run afoul of many members of my family just trying to talk about Islam in, any kind of a scientific way. So I don't know what the question really is, but is it really an institutional issue? I mean, I think that what we're dealing with, or what we're trying to wrap our heads around, and I think you have a much better handle on it. Every time I talk to you, I feel more illuminated about it, but it feels like there is some shift happening around the importance of rightful speech as opposed to the importance of free speech. And in a way, it's kind of a nuance that you are foregrounding in the structure of your book by speaking first about the conscientiousness of language, and secondly, about the sort of principle, the legal principle or the constitutional principle.
Yeah, I mean, I also think things like taboos and conscientiousness are very important, because what they can allow for is a discourse where, I'd say 98% of the time we're sort of, in dialogue with one another. We're not offending one another. People aren't getting upset. There's not intense friction. And then I think you can deal better with the times when, there is that spark of offense or anger, or you're talking about a really touchy sort of third rail type of topic, and you can engage in it because people don't feel like they're being bumped up against all the time. I think that's one of the issues with our discourse now, that people feel hateful speech has run amok, and so they need to police it every single time, and in fact encompass anything that even skirts close to the line. And I think if we could get hate, and I think this was the situation even some years ago, and before all of us were on social media to the degree that we are now, where it felt like there were pretty strong taboos against many kinds of slurs and expressions of denigration, and our discourse moved a little bit freely. But I think it's partially Trump and sort of the uncorking of hatred throughout society that has intensified the drive to police speech in the realms that people feel they can control, whether it's their dorm or their classroom or the magazine they work on, or a Facebook group. If these nefarious sentiments are running loose in society, then sort of, God damn it, we're going to control them here, because this is not going to be that kind of place. And, you can understand that impulse, but it can also be very chilling.
Right. So I want to get back to the question of social media, and actually in particular, I want to get back to the absolutist position of free speech that Mr. Zuckerberg espouses and sort of the centrality. But before we do that, there's been a lot of, just to kind of continue a thread that we're on, which is that the obvious debate in the past weeks and say month and a half or so around cancel culture, the most notable instance being the letter in Harper's. Do you think there is such a thing? I mean, I found myself perplexed by some of the reaction to the Harper's letter alleging there was no such thing as cancel culture, because it seems pretty obvious that there's something like cancel culture going on. Who gets to speak about it and what it's really all about, maybe up for discussion, but just to sort of say that there is no such thing, I mean, to me, doesn't seem real. But I'm more interested in what you have to say about this than myself. So
a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I think the term gets used very elastically, right? Like we think on one end of the spectrum are people like a Harvey Weinstein or a Bill Cosby who've committed heinous crimes. And, they have been essentially erased from the culture, and people, wouldn't talk about them or invoke them or support their work. And, I think few people would argue with that, because of what they've done. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who, have done one fleeting thing. I mean, so one of the examples is this consultant who tweeted out the work of Omar Wasow, suggesting that mass protests may tend toward Republican or conservative political ascendance. And just by tweeting this research out, the consultant apparently lost his job. So, that's one example, but there are many others. A Cornell professor who suggested that a protester who was attacked by police was sort of asking for it. And, other people have sort of done one or two things. And then as a result, there's this mass outcry for reprisal against them. And it's people expressing their own outrage and then being, often it's sort of so quickly that outrage and opprobrium on Twitter seems to veer right into death threats. So, it's like a 0 to 60 in many of these cases. And then very often there is what we were talking about a moment ago, which is kind of the crossover into calls for institutional reprisals. I think that's the cancellation that people are concerned about, that it's the expression of dissenting or unorthodox or questioning views that don't go along with the prevailing dogma, and this sense among those who are sort of part of the reinforcement of that dogma or the effort to drive forward, a certain set of norms and mores that maybe are on the cutting edge or seen as the direction that society needs to go. It's their effort to, essentially pin a scarlet letter on those who depart from that. And I think that is problematic. I think there needs to be a more encompassing approach to our discourse that respects the fact that, yes, we're moving in a certain direction and we have certain deeply held beliefs and values, but that doesn't mean that anybody who stands apart from that is going to be excommunicated, ridiculed, mocked, and reviled as a result. And I think that's where cancel culture becomes so problematic, because it really does, the concern I have is just that it narrows the bounds of our discourse, and it silences people from asking questions that we should be asking. I mean, the way we make progress ultimately as a society, and this goes back to the chapter about why we protect free speech in the first place, is by going back and forth and casting doubt and calling into question and upending and pulling apart other people's arguments. And if you feel like doing that in relation to certain issues is going to land you in the societal doghouse where no one's going to speak to you, you're never going to be invited to anything, you may lose your job. It's a real disincentive. And I try to talk in the book, I have chapters devoted to how to talk about difficult ideas in ways that can get across, that hopefully avoid some of the triggers for that sort of outsized reaction and blowback. And I also talk about the importance of defending even unpopular speech, that if you consider yourself someone who is a proponent of free speech, you actually need to speak up on behalf of those who are being shut down or ridiculed or just cast aside and stigmatized, simply because they expressed a view that people disagree with.
It's it makes me want to say that in a way, I think one of the things that you've done so well in this book is, if you're interested in engaging in public discourse and are cognizant of or afraid of some of the dangers and all of that sort of stuff, and also worried about not giving offense for all the right reasons, your book is a really kind of a good how-to in a way. There's a lot of good guidance in thinking about how to approach some of this stuff. I was thinking as I was preparing to speak with you today about an event that we did together, I don't know, it was maybe a year and a half ago, in which we talked about appropriation to some degree. It was also a moment where there were a lot of book contracts a few book contracts were getting canceled because of some objections on the part of folks who were represented in those books, communities of color and sexuality. I remember saying at the event that if there were sensitivity readers at my publishing house reading my work for the community that I write about, I wouldn't have a career, because so much of what I have done over the years, rightfully or wrongly, rightly or wrongly, people can criticize me for doing it, is to sort of take my own community to task for some of the injustices and frankly, and I say this with kindness and love, as much as I can be perceived to be saying that, this mindlessness that exists within, communities, these insular beliefs and whatnot. But attacking those in public causes offense to some. And so I remember saying that to you at the event, and I wonder about this question of artistic appropriation, and it's an important dimension of the freedom of speech conversation that we have at Penn amongst the writers quite a bit. We had this book that recently came out, American Dirt, where there was some objection on the part of a lot of Latinx writers to the depictions in the book. And it was difficult for us as a board of writers, as a group of writers, to come to consensus about what our attitude should be about this. Whereas I would have imagined that ultimately all of us as writers would want the freedom to write whatever way that we believe we can. I just wonder if you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple things at work. The background context of this is this reality that publishing, whether it's publishing or journalism or television or filmmaking or the theater, have been dominated by certain groups for time immemorial. And there are others, whether it's people of color or immigrants or women, who have been underrepresented and have not had the kind of opportunities for big book contracts or splashy theatrical openings or bylines or all kinds of other things. And that's clearly documented, and the numbers show it, and the progress has been really slow, particularly in publishing. And I talk about in journalism how they've delayed their benchmarks for achieving diversity in newsrooms by more than 20 years now. So it's pretty egregious, and I think people have a really fair lament about that. And I think that lament is what fuels this sense in a case like American Dirt that, hey, wait a minute, not only can we not get book contracts, or if we do get book contracts, our advances are so much less, but here's someone who's telling a story, that's about our community. And, they've had huge support for doing it and a huge marketing budget. And, this sort of adds insult to injury. And I think you're not going to resolve, I believe fundamentally and deeply that we must defend the freedom of the imagination, and that, the whole power of literature lies in the fact that an author can take you into a different world. And, one insight that Jenny Egan, our president, has given to me is that really literature is the only medium where you're actually inside the head of that other individual. You don't really have that in film or in visual arts. And there's something incredibly powerful and transporting about that experience. And, the author takes the reader along, and the author themselves has moved into and invented this other world. And if you start to put boundaries and build walls about where that can and can't be done, and no entry here and a red light here and a stop sign here, I think our literary world would be profoundly impoverished, and there's sort of an endless list of books that could never have been written if those kinds of rules were operative. So I think that's the wrong road to go down. But I think to really convince people of that, you do have to address these issues of equity and exclusion. I think it's sort of the only leverage they have over the discussion is to object to these books. And I understand why people use that leverage. And so, that conversation has actually catalyzed some significant movement within publishing houses. And, the anti-racism protests has led to a couple of very senior level appointments of Black editors in publishing houses. So there is some movement, but it takes an awful lot of mobilization to generate it. And it sort of sometimes takes the form of this unfortunate sort of sense of policing. And I think, your example, I always think about that when you said, if there had been a sensitivity reader, I wouldn't have had a career.
Yeah, right.
And, the fact is you couldn't have written what you've written if you weren't Muslim American. If a white, a Christian or Jewish American tried to write that about the Muslim community, that would, that wouldn't be considered acceptable. Like there are some, just implicit boundaries that,
I think a lot of Muslim Americans feel that it shouldn't be acceptable if a Muslim American does it too.
I know, that's true. That's the power of what you're doing, and why it is so important to have people who will take those risks and to have, who will withstand, the disapproval and criticism that you have endured. I mean, you've gotten a lot of praise, but you've also gotten a lot of harsh reaction among Muslim Americans. And we need to stand by people like that and actually celebrate them to protect that space that they are occupying, which keeps the discourse more open for all of us and stimulates really important discussion and understanding of, the issues that you've probed in your plays and novels.
It's interesting. I mean, as we have sort of explored the nuance, we seem to be drifting now to the other side of the pendulum where we're talking about perhaps a more absolutist free speech position, right? If briefly, as we just kind of meander back and forth. And what I'm interested to know what you think of the absolutist free speech position of, Mr. Zuckerberg at Facebook, which, we see perhaps the kind of inversion yet again of the sort of abuses of that kind of a position when it's married to big tech and the predations of the internet. So anyway, just some thoughts about what's going on with that in Facebook.
I struggle somewhat to evaluate it because I am always questioning the degree to which he is motivated by an effort to avoid antagonizing, over the last 4 years, the president of the United States and triggering what actually is happening now, which is this move to curtail the blanket immunity from liability that the platforms enjoy for user content. So the posts that you or I or others make on the content on the platforms, right now there's this blanket immunity. So they can't be held liable for anything we say, no matter what laws it may violate. And that protection, many credit with the very existence of the freewheeling internet as we know it, and things like Wikipedia and the Internet Archive and these other mass crowdsourced platforms wouldn't exist if everything you put and posted had to be reviewed by a lawyer before it could go up.
Right.
It just wouldn't be possible. And so I think he's been laser focused on an effort to forestall and fend off encroachment on that freedom that they have enjoyed, that really is sort of at the essence of their business model, because they haven't had to pay all those lawyers to vet every single Facebook post. But I think it's become a position that is increasingly impossible to defend, as we've seen the harms of online content becoming so manifest. And COVID has made this glaringly apparent with the spread of conspiracy theories and false cures. We've seen it in the political context. I mean, they just today disabled a few hundred Facebook accounts that were sham accounts posing to be Black Americans who are supporting Trump. And we know that in the 2016 election, these kind of information operations performed on social media that narrowcast, so they are fed just to a very specific, carefully selected target audience. And so the rest of us never see them. So the whole idea of the marketplace of speech and the idea that, if there are falsehoods, they're going to be rebutted. And the answer to problematic speech is more speech, that's sort of defeated by these tactics, because the speech is essentially broadcast in very narrow channels where it doesn't really see the light of day, and there is no sunshine flowing in, and it doesn't get tested or rebutted or refuted. And in fact, it can infect our democracy and lead people to, whether it's not to cast a vote, or to it may change their vote, or convince them that's not worth voting. So there are real dangers. I think we're going to see, essentially Zuckerberg's effort to fend off regulation, I think is failing. And there's a growing consensus that these protections from liability need to be pared back. I think we're going to see much more aggressive policing of speech on the platforms. And, we are seeing that day by day. You hear about new things that are being taken down. There's Trump's video yesterday from Fox News. Today it was, there's Facebook's posts, there are accounts from QAnon that have been taken down in the last few weeks. And so as this moves forward and we move to a climate where online speech is much more tightly policed, what I've argued in the book is that we need to anticipate that there's going to be a fair amount of free speech, legitimate speech that we want to be able to listen to and hear and read, that's going to be suppressed through this policing, and that we need to anticipate that and correct against it. And what's missing really is that fail-safe within the system to ensure that false positives that are in the form of content that is suppressed or demoted or deleted, or accounts that are disabled unjustifiably, that we have really swift remedies, and that you have people in your corner who can argue on behalf of your free speech rights. So I call in the book for the creation of this global content defender that to me is sort of a counterweight against this much more aggressive policing posture that the companies are now adopting in response to pressure from consumers, from advertisers, and from regulators.
Interesting. So we have some questions coming in. There's a slew of questions coming in. They're all great. So I'm just gonna go through them actually.
Right.
So how much of the conflicts that we're talking about are a reflection of the lack of ability or desire to see and accept the complexity of things on all sides?
I think there is, of course that's true. A question I would ask is there anything new in that? I mean, we've always, I think had a human kind of propensity to, make order out of chaos, and perhaps reduce and oversimplify and adopt heuristics that reinforce what we already know and believe. But I do think there's a way in which social media sort of reinforces that. The speed of it, the pithiness, the premium that's placed on the witty rejoinder, and being the first person to make that pun, or come up with that meme, really does sort of drive toward this reflexive response. And one chapter I have in the book is about intent and the importance of intent and context in appraising speech. And I think that's what's so often lost. You see something that seems outrageous and you want to jump on that bandwagon and call it out. And it may be that if you took a few more minutes to look into what it actually was, you'd find it means something quite different, or the person behind it's actually this terrific person, and they intended no offense, and that your reaction should be much more nuanced. But the kind of tenor and pace of our discourse really militates against that, and I think it's dangerous.
Do you have just a follow up to that? Do you have a personal practice that you use to sort of keep that neo-reptilian impulse in place? I mean, how do you are online a lot. I mean, you have to be, you're very good at it. How do you navigate that?
I mean, I do not engage in Twitter battles. I don't,
but presumably you're on Twitter, you read it, you are susceptible, as we all are, to all of the things you're talking about, the really witty rejoinder, this impassioned argument, but how do you manage to, as this questions, how do you keep the complexity of your responses alive given the influences? Because you do that very well. So I'm just sort of asking almost for guidance, really.
I mean, I don't know. I actually found when I was doing a lot of tweeting that it was incredibly distracting, and that I couldn't both be trying to be really active on Twitter and sort of live the rest of my life and, be able to comprise full paragraphs, that they seem to cut against one another. So, I look at Twitter mainly as an opportunity. If I have a thought, a well-developed thought, something that we've written about at Penn or analyzed, and there's an opportunity in the conversation, something has come up on a given day. Like today, it was Tom Cotton has some new proposal for campus free speech, basically to clamp down and punish the universities if they don't do X, Y, and Z. And, that's an issue we've given a lot of thought to at Penn America. And I sort of, could say, I think this is exactly the wrong approach. And if you want to know what the right approach is, here's where to look. And so that's how, I sort of feel like if I don't have a considered view going in, I'm not going to try to formulate it in 5 seconds, because I think that's what's really dangerous. There's a great risk of getting it wrong. And if you do get it wrong, people are going to notice, and then you get into these awkward retractions. And so, I think the better use of it is, where I actually know I have a belief or I have something to say, and, there's a conversational opening in something that the discourse is talking about, where I can offer that up.
So in short, you don't think online. You think, and then online, you are able to express things that you have given some thought to.
I think that's right. Yeah, because I find actually, the minute you start thinking, it's too late.
Yeah.
The discourse has moved on, or someone's already said it, and
right.
So it's just an exercise in futility.
Right. So there's a question here about newspapers and journalists, and I want to read it, but I also want to sort of connect it to something that you were saying about Facebook, which is, in a way, and we did a report at Penn, which you led, of course, about the collapse of local news and the way in which the public space, that is to say, an arena where ideas can be debated, is central to free speech. It's not just the ability to have it's not just the freedom to have the ability to say the things you want. You also have to have a place for them to be heard, and that place has to be as much as possible open. And so the question here is, how big of a risk to understanding and freedom of expression is it that newspapers and journalists rely on now increasingly on non-traditional revenue sources such as donations and billionaires? I mean, obviously, the Washington Post being the obvious example.
Yeah, it's a huge risk. And we did this big report, as you referenced, called Losing the News, that we put out last fall. That's about this crisis all across the country, with more than 20% of local news outlets having been shuttered, and roughly 50% reductions in newsroom staffs all across the country. And corporatization, it's the disappearance of ad revenue. The hedge funds have bundled together a lot of these properties. And in many communities, they're just being starved out. And you don't have the investigative reporters who are holding governors and legislators accountable. You don't have people digging into why the river is polluted, or what's happening with this cluster of cancer cases in a given part of town. And There are just all these stories that are going untold and officials who are not being held accountable. And I think it's a grave danger. We cast it as a free expression issue, even though it's by no means sort of a traditional, it's not a First Amendment issue. And that's, actually one of the other major points I raise in the book is that so many of the issues that really worry us and ought to worry us when it comes to free speech really have very little to do with the First Amendment. So to the extent that we as Americans have been sort of accustomed to relying on our lawyers and our courts to solve all this stuff for us, we can't do that anymore. We've got to dive in and figure out how to, for example, fix this crisis, which we're working on now in Washington. There's no silver bullet solution, but there are a whole series of things. It's partly philanthropy, it's partly a question of more public funding, it's partly innovation in business models, and partly forcing the platforms to pay more for news that is transmitted, in their feeds.
So getting back to the platform dimension of it, there's a question here that says, even if we were to try to exercise oversight over platform policing, how do you address issues around what actually is or is not justifiable, intent versus content? And I guess the question, as you were answering earlier about the absolutist position and sort of the free speech position on Zuckerberg's part and some of the nuances of that, my thoughts ran to the Supreme Court of Facebook, right? Of course, that there's going to be a body of people who are now going to determine this question seems to be getting at that.
Yeah, they've created this oversight board that is supposed to go into effect, I guess, sometime in the fall, and it's a group of about 40 luminaries from all over the world, although disproportionately American, and people with legal backgrounds and tech backgrounds who are supposed to adjudicate the tough questions, like, let's say, the Nancy Pelosi video where her speech is slowed down and it makes it sound as if she's slurring and has a speech impediment. Should that be taken down from the platform or not? And why? And, I think that will be an important contribution, partly because they will articulate a jurisprudence of sort, and there'll be a body of decision that we as the public and researchers can analyze and pick apart and make sense of and use to predict what future decisions might look like. And one of the problems up until now has been there's just absolutely no transparency on how these decisions get rendered. There's no obligation on the part of the companies. They may issue a statement about why they've come to a certain decision, they may not. And so this at least will bring some transparency to that argumentation and an effort to, really, I think, elaborate what goes into those decisions. So I think it's a step forward, but it's not going to be any recourse for the ordinary person who just finds your post has mysteriously disappeared. You wanted to say something about Bernie Sanders or AOC or Erdogan or Bibi Netanyahu, and all of a sudden it's not there anymore. You have no number to call, no reason given. And, to me, that's the real risk to free speech as that policing becomes more aggressive, that, your speech rights are trampled on and there's no recourse right now.
There's a question here that refers to conspiracy theories that I want to distill into a different form and pose you a very, very direct question, which is to say, is disinformation free speech?
Yeah, we actually did a report on this after the 2016 election called Faking the News. And it begins with an essay that I wrote about why fake news, even though overwhelmingly it would be protected by the First Amendment. I mean, the First Amendment allows you to lie and dissemble and exaggerate. The government can't stop you from doing that. But I argued that nonetheless, fake news constitutes a real threat to free expression, because it goes back to something you said a moment ago, which is that it's not enough just to be able to say what you want to say. I mean, free speech rights sort of imply this penumbra of the ability to persuade, the ability to dismantle an opposing argument, and that's what allows the facts to rise to the top. I mean, going back to why we protect free speech in the first place, one of the principal rationales is this idea that through open discourse and the push and pull and give and take, that the best ideas and the most truthful information will rise to the top, and that you can sort it out. And if you're in an environment that's flooded with fraudulent news and deliberately deliberate disinformation and all kinds of efforts to mislead, that process can be irretrievably compromised. And I sort of worry we're on the verge of that right now with the election. People do not know what to believe or where to turn. And it also ties into the diminution of local news, because that's among media sources, local news is by far the most trusted. And yet those outlets in many communities are withering away. So I think we have to have a more expansive vision of what free speech and open discourse entails. And as PEN America, we've sort of tried to take that on and to work on protecting kind of the ecosystem as a whole, rather than just free speech rights as defined in the First Amendment.
Right. Well, it is. I mean, as you argue at the end of the book, that free speech is really at the bedrock of so many things. I mean, it's at the core of what our conception of citizenry and society is. I mean, how we think of ourselves as social subjects. Couple of questions here about appropriation and artistic practice. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to demonstrate your conscientiousness and aplomb with this question. Do you have any thoughts about cultural appropriation in the context of free speech? Isn't it a compliment to want to embrace elements of another culture?
I think that it can be a kind of reverential act, and it's an act of curiosity, and can be an effort to draw attention to a group or a population or a type of story that hasn't gotten as much of a hearing or airing as it deserves. So I absolutely think it can be a sort of homage. I think at this moment it sort of comes in the context of recognizing the barriers of exclusion that have prevented people from telling their own stories. And, part of what I talk about in the book is there's sort of this own stories movement, and the idea of that is really, what we need to do is equip and empower and enable people to tell their own stories. And that, that's sort of more important than your right or opportunity to pay homage, is ensuring that people can tell their own stories. And I have sympathy with that. I think that's true. I think it is important that people in this country grow up feeling like they've got, if they have stories to tell, if they want to be a fiction writer, they want to be a journalist, that they have the chance to do that. And I think, for many people growing up in many parts of this country right now, that's not true. And so I think to realize free expression obligates us to work on dismantling those barriers. That doesn't mean it. I mean, it actually, I don't think it helps necessarily to silence or muzzle, other people who may want to write about cultures not their own. You get into the issues of the sensitivity readers, of how you tell those stories and whether they're true to life and whether that you're sort of tripping into inadvertent offense. And, I think the idea of a sensitivity reader can kind of go too far, but we all, you and I do this, we read each other's stuff. It's a different pair of eyes. People notice things that you might not.
Of course,
and that's an extremely valuable process. So it's hard to, I think as long as it's sort of in that vein, it can be very useful.
I mean, I get this question asked, I get asked this question a lot at events and whatnot. And my response is always, and it's maybe a little facile, is that if you do it well, you probably won't have a problem, and I think that may or may not be true, but it's the answer that I usually, it sounds to me like it's a form of what you're also saying. Did you want to respond to that?
No, I think that's going maybe a little less true, because we're in this pitched moment where
Sure.
The broader context of who's being allowed to do it and not, can sort of rule the day. And it can be less about how well it's done than about who's doing it.
Right. It sounds to me like one of the embedded in one of the sort of assumptions in the way that you're thinking about these larger issues is a nuance that I want to sort of pull out, and maybe we can end with this, which is, it sounds to me like one of the things that you're hinting at is that perhaps our institutions, we can envision institutions and cultural institutions that are robust enough to deal with the criticisms that are coming their way, if those institutions were constituted a little bit differently, which is to say that part of the conflict that's arising is not just an ideological one, it's also one about point of view. And that when those institutions have more diverse points of view, they will be able to receive some of these criticisms. And perhaps that's really where this question of cancel culture, that's really what the nuance is about.
I think that's right. I mean, I think we see that in institutions that have taken steps to diversify their leadership, to address their legacy issues of exclusion. I think there's more space and leeway to even make a mistake. And we've seen this a little bit at Penn, where, I mean, things happen. We have tons of events, and there may be an occasion where somebody does something that offends someone else at one of our events. We know that has happened. And it's sort of at those moments that there's this kind of reckoning of looking at the institution and, who's involved and who are the voices and who's in leadership. And I think if you are in a position to show that the institution has made changes, that there is a diverse group of people who are weighing in, that there are, an organization like Penn, that your public programming reflects a wide breadth of voices, you're in a much stronger position when these kind of inevitable issues arise to be able to say, look, we do take this stuff seriously, and we haven't had our head in the sand, and things may go wrong from time to time. But as an institution, we are committed to dismantling these barriers. And I think that's true at the university. I think as the universities sort of drive forward to the next levels of equality and inclusion, and students of color feel like they have a place on campus. And this is true in many places. I mean, the atmosphere at a place like Cal Berkeley is very different than at a Middlebury. Cal Berkeley, it's a very diverse campus, and at Middlebury, it's sort of the whitest state in the union, and the experience is very different in those two places. And I think, as the universities drive forward, there's actually going to be more space for free speech and for errant views, because there won't be this sense of, acute vulnerability that I think makes it really difficult for people to hear and tolerate speech that seems offensive or in some way victimizing. So, I do think ultimately, you kind of have to do both things. And I talk about that in the book. I have a whole chapter about sort of dismantling these barriers and ensuring that all voices can be heard. Because I think until we do that, we're going to be sort of beset with these tensions over, who has the right to say what and to tell which stories.
The book is called Dare to Speak.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. This is a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you for it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was great doing it with you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining.